I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Paul Szymanski, a noted expert in space warfare theory, policy, doctrine, strategies, and tactics. Paul's background includes expertise in space control, space superiority, force application space situational awareness, space domain awareness, and space battle management command and control, studies, analysis, simulations, and operations research. His career experience includes roles and affiliations with a variety of well-known organizations, including the Aerospace Corporation, Meditech, the Air Force Research Lab, and many others. So, Paul, welcome back. Today we are talking about the escalation of the war in Ukraine and its impact on the space domain in particular. So let me start out by asking you to tell us a little bit about what you do, what organizations you serve, and what your impression has been of recent tensions between the United States and Russia.
Okay, well, I've been helping the United States fight space wars for the past 50 years. I started out actually supporting the Air Staff at the Pentagon, Secretary of the Air Force, and diligently worked my way downward, working at Space Systems Center in Los Angeles, and for the past 30 years, Air Force Research Labs. And I've done mostly policy, doctrine, strategy kinds of things that, the bigger picture. And I've had issues. I haven't met anyone in the U.S. Space Force, whether lieutenant level or general officer level, who really knows how to fight space wars. And everyone keeps thinking in terms of tactical. Oh, we've got this satellite and this other satellite's coming up close to me, and it takes days and weeks and all that. But my simulations have shown a space war is over with in 24 to 48 hours. And the fact that, getting to Ukraine, there's been attacks on satellites. I can go over some of those if you want. But the thing about space is, by definition, it's strategic. You might have this war in Eastern Europe, but you can attack satellites in the South Pacific or anywhere down their orbital path. So in some sense, a space war is a world war. Depends how you define world war. It's not like you're killing anyone, which I suppose you could be Machiavellian about it and say that's a certain beauty for space. But there has been attacks on Russian GLONASS satellites, their GPS kinds of things. There's been certainly jamming and cyber attacks against American GPS. There's been Viasat is a European communication satellite. And way back in February 2022, when the Ukrainian conflict started in earnest, Russia did what was called an acid rain cyber attack by the Russian Military Intelligence Unit, the GRU, that took out the modems of Viasats, which I hear the modems became physically damaged. The Ukrainians were using Viasat for tactical communications on the battlefield, but there was some consequences to that it affected tens of thousands of users, not only in Ukraine but in Europe. Like there was, I think, 5,000 windmills that stopped working. So that was kind of interesting. And like I say, there's been jamming of GPS. I guess with the Viasat attacks, I don't know how much Ukraine is still using that, but Elon Musk, I love the guy, he's a genius. He's a genius, though, because he has a childlike mind, which makes him creative, that's good. But he thought that, I can play with tin soldiers and participate in this war in Ukraine. So he gave, Ukraine his Starlink terminals, and they were merrily going along using those, helping to kill Russians, essentially. And then suddenly, in February of last year, his Starlink satellites started falling out of the sky.
So, Ukraine's former military commander-in-chief Valery Zaluzhny said that the direct involvement of Russia's autocratic allies in its war in Ukraine means that World War III has started. And Vladimir Putin was recently quoted as saying the war is going global. So, do you think that they're correct? And does that make this World War III?
Depends how you want to define a world war. You know, to my mind, space is global, so if you're doing anything in space, it's sort of a world war. But if you go back in history, World War I started in 1911. You know, not 1914, and continued afterwards. So it's all a definitional thing. So traditionally, World War is that adversaries are directly in contact with each other's nationals, instead of this sort of subterfuge that everyone knows, oh yeah, there's American soldiers on the ground, you know, wearing a different uniform. I've heard some parts of Ukraine, the radio nets, the soldiers are talking nothing but Polish, you know. But there's also this, I'm not sure why, people don't declare war anymore. And maybe it's I don't know, was it Clausewitz's war is politics by other means? So people, governments are just like children. They'll do anything they want, and if they can get away with it. And so if it's not particularly public, you can sit there and, you know, propagandize your own people and say, oh, we're really not at war in Ukraine. We gave them $200 billion worth of equipment, and, you know, obviously our people there, a lot of people say these complex weapon systems can't be operated by Ukrainians. They have to be Americans. And, you know, that's politics by another means. So are we at war? I guess it's just I would say yes.
Well, the reason I asked that, I want to go next to your area of specialization. Only a few days after Putin said that the war is going global, Simon Tisdall, writing in The Guardian, said that Russia has been engaged in a shadow war against the West for quite a while, using sabotage, arson, deniable cyber attacks, and aggressive and passive forms of covert hybrid and what they call cognitive warfare. So he didn't specifically mention gray warfare in the space domain, but again, I think this is something that you are an expert in, and I know this has been going on for 11 times. I believe you've talked earlier about 11 basically wars in space, right? And this
That's
is all
correct.
Gray zone warfare.
I think it was about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, it was in the news that there was an incident between an American and a Russian submarine in the Sea of Japan. But I don't know what incident means, you know, torpedoes launched or whatever. And you go to Langley, Virginia, and CIA headquarters, and all these stars on the wall of agents who died. You know, were any of those World War III? No. And so countries love secrecy, and they love undersea warfare. They love spy versus spy, and they love space versus space because they can get away with it. And there's no CNN news camera up there showing it. It's what's called plausible deniability. And I've been on programs where even the president of the United States is not briefed, so that he could say, oh, I didn't know about that. And, you know, how often does that happen? I mean, it's kind of obvious. Even if he did, governments love to lie. I was a professional liar for 27 years, making cover stories. You know, it's classically called the mushroom theory, keep them in the dark and feed them shit. And, you know, governments do that all the time. The main point is not to lose power. Let's face it.
Well, and so this gray zone warfare that's been happening in space, from what I understand, this was one of the major motivators for the creation of the U.S. Space Force, right?
I was in Lyon, France, 2 years ago, and two French lieutenant colonels told me why there's a U.S. Space Force. And, you know, I don't have any security clearances or anything, but he says because of an attack on an American missile warning satellite in 2017 by a Chinese, what I call manipulator satellite. A satellite comes up close with arms and then start tearing it apart. again, this thing of there's the billboard reason, and then there's sewage running underneath. I mean, there's always been things happening in space, and people have been kind of against it politically. Like, oh, war in Antarctica, no, and all that. And you
Yeah.
could see the last few years, the Space Force has been trying to get American citizens used to the concept of war in space. And I'm kind of Machiavellian about it. It's better to fight in space than blow up Ukrainian cities. You're not killing anyone.
Yeah.
And we're to the point of, let's say the United States went to war in the Western Pacific. Would we, be able to, conduct that war without communications? Our carrier battle groups wouldn't be able to communicate back to the United States. We wouldn't be able to see which targets without imagery satellites. We couldn't avoid anti-aircraft batteries without GPS knowing where you're flying and things. I mean, you get to the point of it's almost one of those 1970s Star Trek movies where, oh, you fight in space. If you lose in space, don't even bother to fight on the ground. And
Well, yeah, I think you're going to some amazing points. In terms of space warfare, in the past, I mean, you talked about like threats on orbit. I know anti-satellite missiles have been developed. You've mentioned several cyber attacks on communications links, right? The upload and download links to these satellites. So 3 weeks ago, Russia launched a new hypersonic ballistic missile into Ukraine, which technically transits the space domain on its way to the target. So what are your thoughts on this, and how does this change the game in terms of space warfare?
That's the biggest point I'm going to make today. I did some of the original research in the 1980s on space-to-Earth weapons. Very effective, went up to the National Security Council. So what you can do, they don't have... First of all, in the 1960s, Russia invented the concept of FOBS, Fractional Orbital Bombardment System, where ICBMs, instead of being sent north, are put into a partial orbit and sent south over the South Pole. And I think it was about 2 years ago it was announced that China has these FOBs. And the stated purpose for China is to take out American aircraft carriers, Taiwan and all that. So anything coming down from space, deorbiting, let's say 2 tons of concrete, is at Mach 26 and 3 times hotter than the surface of the sun. Now, I theorize, and actually I'm writing a book on this, that one night, within 20 minutes, all American aircraft carriers around the world get sunk. 2 tons of concrete, and I say that facetiously, you'd have something that's more aerodynamic, but let's say 2 tons of concrete loaded down on an American aircraft carrier, 100-foot hole in the hull where the edges are gleaming bright red from this 3 times hotter surface of the sun. It hits the cold water, huge steam explosion, it sinks in minutes. We are a sea power, we are not a land power. Good luck marching a million men across the North Atlantic Ocean to defend Europe. Suddenly the U.S. is no longer a major power. If it doesn't control the sea, and this is like Mahan, the classical things, no one's been able to control the sea. But from space, you can control all oceans. And, we've been very lucky to have these oceans as barriers for us. And I think we've gotten kind of arrogant about it. Oh, we can conduct wars all around the world, and it'll never really affect the homeland because no one has, landing craft that can go across the oceans and all. But suddenly it's our tomb. If no one's allowed to have shipping unless a potential adversary, whether that's Russia or China, suddenly control all the seas. And if you've got all of this oil in the Middle East, it's worthless if you can't ship it out. So that to me is the danger, and that's why you need space warfare to be able to control that if you can, because you could hide these weapons and defunct satellites up there for years. You never know where they're going to come down, either on that or take out we have 3 launch sites in the United States launching for satellites. that's easy to take those out too. $1 billion launch gantry cranes and all that. And if we had like a colony on the moon, it'd have to surrender to, I don't know, the Chinese colony or something like that. I mean, this is what's being illustrated by the Russian Oreshnik. The proper pronunciation, if you listen to Putin, is a ka at the end. Now, that only goes, I think, 10 to 11 Mach, because I think, yeah, it ballistically goes up in space a little bit, but it comes down. That, to me, is the biggest threat. And there's a lot of misinformation from supposedly knowledgeable people. One of the top people, and I won't mention his name, maybe because I forgot it, on the internet saying, oh, well, these things only create a crater 10, 20 feet deep. This has got to be kidding. If you've got a pound of lead going at 12,000 feet per second is equivalent to a pound of TNT. These hypervelocity weapons do not have explosions on them. It must liquefy the ground. And I think it was about last year or 2 years ago, there was a rumor that there was an underground command post, joint NATO and Ukrainian in Kiev, and it was 400 feet underground, with emphasis of was, and a Russian hypervelocity weapon took it out. I have the video of that. One night in Ukraine, the whole sky lit up in the middle of the night, and some security camera caught the thing coming straight down. It, what do you call it? Meteorites coming down, come horizontal, not straight down. And so people are saying it can go down to 600 feet,
so
these RV reentry vehicle kind of weapons. And we're still talking 1960s technology, MIRVs for nuclear and all that. I don't think we're talking anything that just about anyone can do. I mean, I seen pictures of Iran having hypervelocity missiles. How the hell did they get those where we don't even have them?
Yeah. So I think to put a pin in really what you're saying here is, I said this when this first happened. I thought to myself, thank God this isn't nuclear. But what you're saying is hypersonic kinetic weapons by themselves are incredibly devastating. And this definitely changes the game in terms of warfare in general
claims
and space war.
It's just as good as nuclear. I mean, nuclear, you're going to have this miles of destruction. This is very precise. I think if you had a division of Army soldiers, you're going to kill 100 of them, but not 5,000 or something. It really is a precision strike weapons. Now, in some sense, that's a problem because you'd be more inclined to use it if it's not a nuke. But you're killing fewer people too, so I don't know. Well,
Putin framed the initial IRBM attack as a response to NATO's use of UK Storm Shadow and US ATACMS long-range missiles to strike targets inside of Russia, and he claimed on November 28th that mass production had started of these. So if these IRBMs begin to see regular use in warfare, how do you think that'll change our space domain military posturing? And do you think it'll lead to a larger role and potentially rapid growth in our Space Force, space defense assets, and things along those lines?
Dramatic changes in warfare. And, I'm thinking in terms of Billy Mitchell, 1920s, and, all these beautiful, expensive battleships are vulnerable to airplanes now. Okay, now we're vulnerable to space planes, or whatever you want to say. Suddenly, 100 years ago, they're like, we really got to build up our Air Force now and stuff like that. And now, we'd have to build up the Space Force. The trouble is services are, very static. And it's a problem for them to adjust. Even though the Space Force, it's new, 95% Air Force thinking the same old way of when's the last time the air war was in doubt for the Air Force? 80 years ago, World War II. And so that you have that kind of thinking. And, everyone I've talked to, I've never met anyone in the Space Force who thought strategically. And space is strategic. And certainly these hypervelocity weapons are strategic. And I'm old enough to know that in some sense, you're not fighting the war, you're fighting the peace. The whole point of the war is geopolitical realignments afterwards. And so, what are the consequences of using certain weapons? And oh, by the way, what we're doing in Ukraine is we're teaching the Russians how to fight us better next war around. Same now, maybe they're teaching us with hypervelocity weapons. And you're really setting the post-conflict political landscape of, new treaties and things like, I won this space war, but look at all this debris. Now all your allies are mad at you, so you sort of lost it. I mean, when you think about it, again, being Machiavellian and really the bigger picture, Britain lost World War II. And you say, oh, that's crazy. They, invaded Germany and, took over West Berlin and all this stuff. Yeah, but they lost the British Empire because of it. The biggest disaster in British history. So, you've got to think these things through, and I don't think anyone is. That's why I keep proposing we need a space warfare think tank to think of, look at these shiny new space weapons. I know, I've been on 12 different space weapons programs, and you're just itching to push that button, but no one's asking why and when and what are the consequences.
Well, and I think that is incredibly interesting, and I think that it's also incredibly dangerous, this transition from, again, what you've talked about in the past, the first time that you came on and did a presentation on my podcast, and thank you so much for doing that. You had focused so much on gray zone tactics, but what I'm seeing is this potential for hot warfare, and we've got, anti-satellite hypersonic missiles. We have, as you mentioned, the potential to create debris clouds in space, lots of different things, in addition to this, this new Russian IRBM missile, right? So if this transitions from gray zone to hot zone warfare, that really worries me that we may not be prepared for that. And I'm not sure if really anyone is prepared for that.
I think countries don't really want total war unless you're so podunk country and you're about to lose your dictatorship or something like that. There's always measured responses, most world actors. So the Oreshnik, maybe they'll use it again, especially after they killed that Russian general. But they sort of been holding back, not using it every week kind of thing. So it's just another, arrow in your quiver. It's very effective. I don't know how you defend against it, but sooner or later there'll always be some defense. You'll figure it out. I still don't think it's like the dramatic potential of a nuclear weapon, but let's say in some strange world somebody attacked the White House with these non-nuclear hypersonic weapons and killed the president. Well, would there be a nuclear response? And you'd have to really worry about that and not just go willy-nilly and say, let's blow this up and that up. There's always consequences. If you took out a weapons factory in Dnipro, a few weeks ago with these Oreshnikas, well, that's just a military thing, You didn't necessarily take out senior leadership in Kiev. It was a measured response. So it's still kind of incremental improvements and things. And certainly there was a point where there was this battleship competition, 100 years ago, and suddenly battleships we don't even use anymore. And suddenly it was airplanes and aircraft carriers, and I think they're pretty vulnerable now. It's cannon versus castle wall. You always have these imbalances, but were any of them ever totally war-winning dramatic? Ultimately.
Well, and when you mention like sea warfare, right? Especially America's role in protecting the seas today, space has a parallel with that, which is commercial satellite constellations, right? And I think the big one is the 6,700 plus Starlink satellites that are in orbit. If this conflict escalates into hot warfare in space, it seems like they would be a sizable target to protect. And I should also mention that, Starlink has been used by the Ukrainian forces. The Russians have already tried to disrupt its service in Ukraine, and Starlink offers a way around the Great Firewall of China, right, which is planning to have its own mega constellation as a competitor. So to me, it seems like both Russia and China have reasons that they would want to attack Starlink in particular, but then commercial satellites in general.
Well, some say
as well, right?
600,000 Russians have died in Ukraine. That sounds serious to Russia. Yet, I am surprised they haven't taken out our imagery satellites that are targeting Russians in Ukraine. So, there always seems to be this holding back kind of things. And I know they've done some attacks, and I'm sure they've done multiples of the ones I know about. I'm sure there's this whole cat and mouse games of satellite inspectors looking at each other and things like that. But a whole war where you wipe the slate clean in space, I haven't seen, and I'm surprised the Russians actually haven't done that. And people, I think, rather simply think, oh, there are 6,000, there's going to be 10, 15,000 Starlink satellites. We got to attack every single one. No, there's all kinds of cyber things. I could just fantasize that the Starlink satellites, they have an algorithm inside of them that if they get too close to each other, they start maneuvering away. Well, cyber attack puts a negative sign in that algorithm instead of positive, and they start maneuvering close to each other, and they all kill each other off. There's always a way. Humans are really clever, especially when you're about to die. And I don't think there's any way you could truly think, oh, I'm invulnerable to cyber attack. I mean, I've seen all kinds of strange cyber capabilities 35 years ago, and even better yet now. So I think there's still this subtlety. It's not like Russia took several million men and put them in Ukraine and wiped them out in a few weeks, blitzkrieg. And it's not like so far have we put hundreds of thousands of American soldiers in Ukraine and did it. It's all this kind of subtlety that's been happening in Afghanistan and Vietnam and Iraq and the Middle East now. We expected Iran to do a big punch back to the Israelis, but not. And so I guess there's calmer heads somewhere because they understand that there are consequences to certain things. And you certainly can get away with a lot of subtlety in space. You can show resolve and will. It provides additional rungs on a conflict escalation ladder, and that's all good. And I suppose there'd be a motivation to kill a whole bunch of satellites if you yourself, your regime is about to die, the death throes, maybe, if you even have enough of heavy anti-satellite missiles or something like that. I don't know if anyone really does.
I did want to ask if the space domain, if you see that increasing in importance, if hostilities continue to escalate due to things like this suspected cutting of communications cables in the Baltic Sea, if we can't rely on these undersea cables, right, then it seems like that would push more communications traffic, especially command and control stuff, up into space. So do you think, again, as things escalate, space will become just
You're lucky.
more important?
25 years ago, I did a study on submarine cable vulnerabilities in the Pacific. And you're talking, if you took out the cables in two places in the Pacific using 19th century technology, cutting anchor cables, you bring down the whole network. Now, they're all fiber optics. And I think back then it was like 95% of all communication out of the continental U.S. is submarine cables, not satellites. They really can't handle. Maybe if they get to optical communications with their, they have some capabilities, but I don't know. The subcables are very vulnerable to just about anybody in a trawler, I guess, where you have to be a little more sophisticated with satellites, though. Any kid hacker in association with some podunk government could probably still hack satellites or have research grade lasers at the universities to point at satellites and things like that. Certainly that's a threat for communications. I mean, it's the same with the gas lines that were cut. And it's like, well, sort of who did it? And it's a whole propaganda thing on that. When we, you saw how vulnerable we were during COVID to disruptions, to just little things. Oh, I can't find any toilet paper now. My maid's stealing it from me now, Just think if you truly did do a communications attack. And not only the submarine cables, but one way to attack satellites is to seal them off from the Earth. You've got billions of dollars of satellites up there, but if you can't communicate with them and reconfigure them or whatever, they're worthless. So if you have a way, jammers, cybers, or something on the battlefield, you've done space warfare without touching any satellites in particular.
Well, and I'm going to put links in the show notes back to your website and some of your past presentations, your past podcasts that we did, and so people can learn more about what you've worked on. Again, you have done so much in terms of gray zone warfare, right? And I think that most people aren't aware of how much has been going on there. I'm talking about threats on orbit and, again, cyber attacks on command and control links, things along those lines. What intrigued me and terrifies me is if things escalate from gray zone to hot zone warfare. And to be quite honest, I was shocked by the IRBM. I woke up to a story. Initially, the Ukraine reported it as being an ICBM. And when I woke up and read that, I said, oh my God, that's it, And they've kind of walked that one back. Right? It wasn't an ICBM because we're all afraid of those. It's only an IRBM. But I guess this prospect that, we may be going from gray zone to hot warfare is still incredibly terrifying. And that was one of the things that had intrigued me about the space domain also, because it has been gray zone for so long, right? That what happens if they start to use things like fractional orbital bombardment.
Well,
like
certainly it's a shock to people, space warfare. In spite of all the Star Trekkies and things like that. But in some sense, you don't see it. You're not going to see explosions in the sky. Your internet stopped working today, maybe. And even news media...
Yeah.
How do they know a space war happened? It's not like, somebody shot down a satellite. Well, it doesn't come down. It's not like an aircraft where you see wreckage on the ground. If there was a major war, certainly Russia has been trying to take out, and probably has succeeded, taking out the Ukrainian electricity network and heating and all that. So they will go against civilian infrastructure. It's like anything else, though. Are you intimidated from doing certain actions because of possible repercussions? And why are you doing it? Is there a real purpose, benefit versus deficit on taking out all these satellites. I mean, some have theorized, oh, North Korea, they're really bad dudes and they have nukes and they'll nuke something in space and take out all the space forests from the radiation, you know. And I'm kind of thinking, well, okay, maybe if you're that crazy. But the biggest thing someone can do in the 21st century is explode a nuke in anger. And if you did that in space, it's not like anyone particularly sees it anyway, you know, it's just over North Korea. If you're going to have all those repercussions, you want a big smoking hole in the ground to be very dramatic about it, I would think. So is there a benefit from somebody taking out all those capabilities? Now, I say in a sense, yes. As I mentioned earlier, how does the U.S. conduct a war on the ground if it doesn't have space assets? And I'm just actually, I almost can say shocked that Russia hasn't done more. It has done some. It has taken out some commercial imagery satellites. For all I know, it's gone against our National Reconnaissance Office satellites. I don't know for a fact. I mean, why wouldn't you? What is deterring Putin from doing that?
Well, and, you know, a moment ago when you talked about Russia destroying ground infrastructure in Ukraine, right? I mean, that, again, it seems like that pushes things up into the space domain because of the mobility aspects of it. If you don't have land-based telcos, right, because they've been bombed, you can use things like Starlink as backup.
No, that's true.
That would be
if you
my
can
thought.
afford it
So,
and all. I'm not sure there's enough Starlink satellites for everyone to be watching YouTube, you know, 10 million people at once, you know, kind of thing. And I saw an interesting story in India. It was the biggest story of the day that they found a Starlink terminal in India. And it's like, oh, that's illegal, I guess, but it was considered really a terrible thing, you know. And so I don't know if it's the same with China. Oh, you better not have these things or we're going to shoot you or something.
well, yeah, that goes to another aspect of it, right? Because Starlink allows people in general to bypass the you know, the quote unquote Great Firewall of China, if I understand things correctly. And so again, one of my thoughts there is that, you know, countries with authoritarian regimes who may want to control what their public is able to see or, you know, interface with, they might not want that. Now, I understand, again, China is looking at building its own 40,000 satellite mega cluster, right? So they're approaching
I don't know,
it
maybe
from
you
kind
can
of a
still
different
control it.
perspective. But,
and of course, you're monitoring all conversations, I guess, if you own the satellites. I noticed something in the news a few days ago that Russia just deployed some sort of system that detects who has Starlink terminals in Ukraine and maybe Russia. So for what that's worth, you're not entirely invisible.
Well, another thing I had wondered about, and I don't see this as being as practical, but Russia and Ukraine are both involved in drone warfare very heavily. Do you think that the command and control for those drones
Well,
can
certainly
be pushed
that's
through
what they were
satellites,
using,
or is the time delay just...
Elon Musk Starlinks for? But something else, I saw a technical analysis. Ukrainians have these, they look like Piper Cub airplanes, but they're smaller, and they're drones, and they go hundreds of kilometers into Russia. And they were saying in this thing that, they've got two controllers. One flies and the other one releases the bombs or something like that. And my first thought was, it's got to be satellites. What satellites did they use to control that? And it's probably, I don't know. You know, Elon claimed he wasn't going to allow Ukraine to do that. Maybe he did anyway. Or maybe there's American systems on that. But that was confusing to me that at that distance, you've got to have some sort of satellite communication. Now, let me get back to kind of a slightly different issue. And that is when we had drones in Iraq and Afghanistan, they were controlled out of Creech Air Force Base in Las Vegas, Nevada, you know. And how are they controlled? Oh, via satellite. Okay. What satellite? Well, at least years ago, it was Intelsat was one of them. International Telecommunications Commission, whatever. I think about 80 countries are part of this international consortium. And so here you are part of the kill chain using this. And does that mean legally a Intelsat control center in, let's say, France is a legal target because they're part of the kill chain, on that. So you're getting to that point of using commercial systems in warfare. Now, World War II, we used, commercial ships, transiting the Atlantic and putting, munitions. Like even World War I, Lusitania sank so fast because it had munitions in it, kind of thing. And I don't know how that exactly works, that if your ship gets sunk in war, does the government pay you for that or something? And so they're working that out with using commercial systems. That's the latest in thing. And that's great. But, how Russia, Ukraine assassinated a Russian general a few days ago. So can a country assassinate the CEO, like United Healthcare, of a satellite system that's killing not only my soldiers, but just killed my wife and children in the conflict zone?
Well, the entire thing is a tremendous gray zone. And with drone command and control, right, you were talking about drones being controlled was hundreds of miles away from, where they were flown, so satellites must be involved. My mind wonders if that traffic might be just regular internet traffic, right? And so if that's the case, it would just basically blend in. Maybe no one would be aware that that's being used to control.
I saw
an autonomous
video. Somebody in China had it looked like a rifle, but it was a jammer, cyber weapon, and it brought down a drone in China. You could see it coming down. So these things are jammable or cyber weapon things. So you must sort of know where the signal is. Though it probably doesn't work for satellites. I think the radio direction would be different on that. So I don't know, but
Now, could you put jamming on? Could you put jamming on a satellite? That would be interesting also, because again, what we're seeing is this enormous increase in drones and autonomous weapons, and so there's an increase in electronic command and control signals and data flow and all of that.
yeah, I don't know if
I haven't seen any
let's see,
suggestion yet that you could.
usually you jam what link? Maybe you jam the uplink or something. One's a smaller power signal. I doubt you could jam up in a satellite because you're talking tens of thousands of kilometers away, and the signal is not like a laser. It would spread out pretty good. I know there's all kinds of signals intelligence satellites collecting this stuff. I could be wrong. Maybe there's a way. There's probably a way not necessarily to jam power-wise, but to cyber attack it from space. Now the thing is you, if you've got low Earth orbit, you've got these satellites moving by within maybe 5 to 7 minutes, and then the next satellite would have to pick up. If you want continuous coverage, it'd have to be from geosynchronous, 36,000 kilometers away. That might be hard to do. So I'm not sure you could do that from space as well, especially if you're talking about, there's an attack by 500 drones, and I got to take it out.
Yeah, no, there's so much change so rapidly here, and again, these IRBMs, that for me, that was the, I kind of had this mental map, I guess, of here are the satellites, and here's how gray warfare is traditionally conducted, right? And now all of a sudden you've got IRBMs going into and out of space,
well,
right?
Even
albeit
the
at lower altitudes. But,
hypervelocity weapons launched from aircraft actually loft up into space a little bit, some of them, because that's how you're getting that speed, theoretically Mach 26 coming down from space. Not exactly, it didn't go into orbit. So I think a lot of them are that way to begin with. And I wouldn't concentrate on this IRBM versus ICBM. I'm sure you could very easily put the Oreshnik on an ICBM. They purposely don't want to make people nervous, and they're going to push that nuclear button if they see these ICBMs coming out. And they say, oh, don't worry, they're just conventional. Well, yeah, I don't trust that. As a matter of fact, I don't know if it was for that Oreshnik attack or one of these attacks, the Russia actually called the United States saying, don't worry, it's not nuclear. So everyone's concerned about that. Now, just going back, the Chinese attack on an American missile warning satellite is absolutely insane. So people aren't necessarily thinking these things through, because it appears to me before you start a nuclear attack on an adversary, you would take out the eyes and ears in space so they wouldn't know how many missiles are coming at you and how many new deaths are happening. I don't know. I mean, those should be sacrosanct. So I'm using that as an example of, I think there is crazy behavior that people are capable of, I guess, that, well, even us, why the hell do we keep trying to escalate the war in Ukraine? It's over with. It's almost as if we really do want war.
Yeah.
And maybe it's our psychology of what I mentioned earlier. We've got these oceans defending us, and, oh, that's Eastern Europe. They're Slavic. We don't care, kind of thing. I mean, you could do a thought experiment of, France attacked, or Italy attacked France, let's say. Would we give France $200 billion worth of weapons to kill as many Italians as possible? I don't think so.
Well, I think, that aspect, and this kind of goes off space war, but this is something I've been thinking about a lot lately. America, my impression was that we were relatively
until
isolationist,
after World War II,
right?
yeah.
Up until...
Because no one could attack us anyway,
Yeah. And
what's the point?
yeah, and I mean, my ancestors on mom's side, my ancestors came over on the Mayflower, and they came here to get away from European strife, right? They wanted a new beginning. That was the whole idea behind coming here. And I think for generation after generation of immigrants, there's some version of that, right? People come here to leave behind a lot of the problems of where they're from. They come here to start fresh. And so America has been traditionally somewhat isolationist. And then after World War II, we did get pulled into this,
Right.
America world police role that we're in now, right? And I don't think anybody's happy with that. I don't think we're happy with that.
We're
don't
not
like
happy.
paying for it. We
I
don't like
talked
having
to someone from
maintain
Pakistan
82
earlier
bases.
in the week, and they were saying, "Oh, it's great the U.S. controls these, tamps down on all these crazies around the world." I don't know, but let me tell you about one of the more interesting things I've seen lately. You can look it up on the internet. It's a map of all the wars that have happened around the world for the past 5,000 years, going to 3000 BC. And you look at that map, and 90% of the wars are in Europe. Those Europeans love war, and then even look at our history. We have a major war every 20 to 25 years, going back even before the U.S. was a country, And I saw something crazy. I went to the Army Library years ago in Washington, D.C., and there was this old book from the 1920s, and all these senior officials wrote about how the main purpose of war was to get rid of your young ones so the older people can have more women or something crazy. It sounds crazy, but 20 to 25 years is a cycle of a new generation. It's almost like a natural process. And I remember something else.
Oh, interesting.
The American Indian Wars. And they wrote this treaty, and all the young bucks, Indians, complained about it, saying, we need to go to war so that we can show how we're the bravest warrior and get the best women. I don't. That's crazy. I'm not claiming this is true, but you're talking about getting away from the wars from
Well, no.
Europe and
So
all
you're
that.
saying, yeah, you're describing war as a natural population control
Yeah,
mechanism,
I don't
which is
know.
something I've
I
read in the
can't claim
past,
it's
right?
true. But
So war and famine is another one, right? Disease. Yeah, there have been these. I believe they were called Malthusian controls on population, and we've largely eliminated those. War we haven't eliminated, but we've
maybe.
changed the way it's fought. Now, what is interesting though is we are going into what's called demographic transition, not just America, but the entire world. And so birth rates are starting to plummet. So these natural controls that we've had in the past on birth rate, if they continue, they will actually cause more problems. What I mean is, as the world industrializes, right, as we become more advanced, increases in education and birth control are lowering global population rates. I think Japan may
Yeah, I
be
hear
the
you
most
can buy
extreme
homes really
example
cheap
of
there.
that.
Italy too
So,
is losing its population. Then I heard something like China, it's going to goner, and I think in the next 50 years because of that one-child rule. There's not enough women
yeah,
to reproduce. And so they're going to have half the population, I think it's 30, 40 years from now. I mean, just mathematically. So half of the buildings are empty. And I don't know how that all works. Now in India, I was in India
yeah.
a year
So
and a half ago, and they have ads on TV about not birth control, but here's how to have even more children.
I believe India even. I believe they are even being affected by this. If I remember correctly, and this is from a past interview I did research on, they said that pretty much every place in the world is going to be going through demographic transition except Africa in the next few years, and they're expecting it to affect Africa a few decades after that. And Africa is just lagging the rest of
Well,
the world
one
in
theory I
industrialization,
have,
I guess.
Russia is the largest landmass on Earth, and if all that tundra starts, global warming, thawing out, suddenly you have these vast lands like the American West from 150, 200 years ago. And yeah, they're having population
Oh,
problems.
yeah.
But suddenly, if this whole place opens up, like, oh, you can get free land like we used to have here, just go over there and claim it. Would that make a big difference, let's say? Something China can't do because it's all deserts and,
Well,
and things like that. Even us, I mean, I live out here in the West. You can go 100 miles and not see anyone. Like in Europe, though, they say, oh, you go every 10 miles, you see a village, kind of thing. So there is those forces going on that I don't know if people really thought through. And getting back to what I was saying about control of the seas, you get back to the point of maybe 500 years ago that only land armies matter. If space controls the seas, whoever controls the world is the one with the largest land army. And if China, let's say, did this attack on American aircraft carriers and controls the seas, the only one who can deal with it is the 1.4 billion Indians. You take 1% of them and you've got, 14 million man army and things like that. So we sort of flip.
Well, and India is getting into space as well. So going back to our space discussion, that's something that I've neglected for the most part today. I've really tried to focus on Russia and the United States, but yeah, China is becoming a major space power.
Well, I have a whole chart
as well.
I can present sometime of my assessment of who are the space powers. In India, they had the mission Shakti or something a few years ago. Everyone starts out with direct descent anti-satellites and makes debris. I mean, we did that. I was on the program in the 80s at the Pentagon. Russia's done that. China's done that. I've heard debris from their test in, was it 2009 or something, actually destroyed one of their live satellites. So everyone starts with that. But China's serious. The U.S. is serious. Russia is serious in space. India, they have, so maybe they have 4 or 5 missiles stored somewhere. That I've been
Okay.
on
So
multiple
they're lagging,
space
in
weapon
other
laser
words.
programs, and the trouble is you have to wait 30 days for all the targets to come over, and hope there isn't clouds in the sky and stuff like that. It's not really militarily effective if a space war is over within 24 to 48 hours. So I judge India, it's an ego trip, to say, oh, we're just as powerful as you are. And I'm sure they maybe have some sort of cyber laser. I mean, it doesn't take much to do that. But how serious can you be? And the latest in thing are these rendezvous and proximity operations, RPO. I call them maintenance satellites, inspector satellites. Everyone around the block has to have them. The U.S. proudly talks of the 6. I'm sure there's more. I've been in
Yeah.
5 different programs. China has one with manipulator arms that, what was it, about a year and a half ago? They grabbed one of their supposedly dead satellites and pulled it to graveyard orbit. I can go over the whole thing, but that was all fake. That was probably a space weapon floating around up there. When I was in France, they talked about putting up one of their own inspector satellites, and they proudly told me about their mobile laser blinder that can blind imagery satellites, turn up the power, and damage them. UK, I hear, has some sort of program for inspection satellites. So that seems to be the in thing. But inspection satellites are, in some sense, the most effective space weapon. To my mind, it's the equivalent of taking a satellite, putting it in a wheelbarrow, wheeling it into your garage, and going at it. Let's drill a hole, cut this wire, saw this, bend this, whatever. But it takes days and weeks to come up close to kiss some other adversary, and then he might shoot back or start spinning or I don't know what. So that's sort of the mentality of the Space Force that I can detect, sort of tactical thinking. But that's almost pre-conflict. That's not militarily responsive, to my mind. Not sure what is exactly. Most countries seem to like the cyber weapons. And I don't know if I went through it with my previous discussion, but I do this thought experiment of, you're in the Ukrainian trenches and you hear the Russian tanks revving up to come attack you, and some egghead scientist shows up with this black box with a big red button and says, I've been working for years in the lab. This is a cyber weapon that'll stop those tanks. All you have to do is push that button. And it worked every time in the lab. Goodbye. And so, the tanks come, you push the button, they go, and stop. And 30 seconds later, they reboot and come in and squish you, And it just seems to me it's more satisfying to see a burning hole in the ground where the tank was, with a bazooka or something. There's cyber. And the same with satellites. Oh, I attacked this satellite with a cyber weapon and it looks dead. Well, we've gotten spoiled having wars with podunk third-rate countries who really don't even understand strategy and all that. But if you're talking about the Western way of war, 90% of wars over the past 5,000 years maybe even made you genetically inclined that way. People are going to fool you and do all kinds of crazy things. And so I don't even know if cyber is really that effective in space. It feels good, plausible deniability. You can lie, oh, I didn't really do it. It's like the attack on the Iranian centrifuges, nuclear centrifuges. Who really did that? Was it, Israel, U.S.? I don't know. But you can get away with it. And if I'm doing a bitch session here, it's the same with treaties about space. Well, how do you verify anything, ultimately? And it sounds good, but I've worked on programs where we routinely violated international treaties. It's the first thing to throw out when it comes to war. World War One, first thing the British did were bomb the submarine cable anchor points coming into Germany, and all this. It's just when you're about to die, you don't really care about the rules as much. And you could see the flailing about in Ukraine. like killing that Russian general. Well, is that going to make any difference, or is it just sort of a pissy thing, that we're going to do right now? I don't know.
Yeah. Well, Paul, on that note, let me thank you so much for your time today. We've run through a lot of different topics, most relating to space warfare, but I think also many of the, the land and ocean-based aspects of this that it relates to. So let me thank you so much. Again, thank you for providing service to our nation in terms of space warfare expertise for so many years. And I would love to have you back on in the near future to talk more about gray zone warfare, which I know is
Sure, we
the
could do
majority
that.
of what
I
you've
actually
spoken
have
about.
an hour and a half,
let me-
2 hour briefing on details of the subject of space warfare. Not technical, but
Yeah, that would
policy,
be
doctrine, consequences. So if we ever want to do a really big podcast.
Wonderful. Thank you again
Okay,
so
have a
much
good
for
one.
your time today, sir.